Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Rationally Speaking with me and my co-host, Stuart Carrington. This is a podcast where we have conversations about rational emotive behaviour therapy, or REBT, and in particular, I guess me and Stuart are interested in the world of performance, mainly sport, but we'll for sure get onto other bits and pieces. Hopefully, you've listened to the conversations we've had currently. If not, by all means, go back and listen to those. And today we're going to continue the conversation and go a little bit more in depth in one of the aspects of REBT.
When we're from an REBT perspective, should we be looking at disputing maladaptive emotions, i.e., sort of challenging, helping people to self-dispute and to challenge like these thoughts they have, i.e., it's not the end of the world, it's certainly not welcome or not pleasant, but you'll cope, you'll be okay? Or do we challenge goals, or do we do both?
Well, I would argue that the challenge in REBT will come at B. I'm not sure if we're necessarily challenging people's goals. I think it's becomes self-evident when somebody's goals aren't oriented correctly, because they'll keep hitting the wall, and they won't get to where they want to get to. So that means that we can sometimes take a step back and try to understand, how do we fashion some goals that are actually going to help you to pursue your broader goal, whatever that broader goal is. So I think you try to move beyond superficial short-term goals. You try to figure out, well, where do you really want to get to as a human being? What is that contentment, that fulfillment that you seek? How would you define that? How would you picture that? What's the idealized vision? I don't have a problem with people I'm working with having perfectionistic visions to aim towards. As long as they understand that perfection isn't possible, and it's a theoretical, it's an abstract construct. It's not necessarily achievable. But having an idealized vision of who you want to be as a human being, the life that you want to live, I think starts to put in context some of the more superficial and short-term goals that you might have in pursuit of that long-term goal. And by doing that, it also makes some of these setbacks and issues that you face naturally as part of pursuing any goal. It makes some of those things more tolerable because they're within the context of a broader sort of journey. I'm not really keen on the word journey because it sounds a bit cheesy, but you're in pursuit of something grander than I'm going to win that trophy, I'm going to earn that money, I'm going to get that accolade. If you're doing those things, then it's all in service of a grander vision, which allows you to look back on your life and say, I lived a good life. Now, this is very stoic. This is about eudaimonia rather than being hedonistic, focusing on the next shiny thing. This is embedded within REBT, but it's sort of been put aside a little bit because we focus a lot on irrational beliefs and on the C part, on the unhealthy and healthy negative emotions. But this G philosophy is in there, and it's so I wouldn't necessarily say Stu, that it's about challenging and disputing goals, but I think it becomes self-evident for the person that maybe their goals need a little bit of reshaping and need reorientation. Then you can proactively think about, okay, here's your grander goal. Here's the thing you want to aim for. It's a eudaimonic goal. It's about contentment and fulfillment as a human being. What are the kinds of adversities that you're going to face in pursuit of that goal? Some are predictable, some aren't. How do we respond to that unpredictability? What are the kinds of beliefs that you might throw at this thing that might hinder your progress towards that goal through experiencing dysfunctional emotions and behaviors that take you away from where you want to get to? So it allows you that proactive stance of starting from G and going forward. So earlier in the conversation, we spoke about how C is a piece of information that we work backwards from. You can flip it. We don't have to start or end anywhere. We can work on any of these G's, A's, B's, and C's. And the proactive version of that is, starting from G, helping the individual to orient themselves towards a goal that is meaningful to them as a human being, then figuring out how to help them to get there through regulating emotion and behavior.
So we're back to this, like, what's attractive about REBT, and again, this is something that really appealed to me, was this flexibility of it. There are times where people may feel particularly anxious, for instance, and they want to calm down, and that's their goal at that particular time. I just want to feel better. So as a therapist, you might concentrate on the C at that particular point. They probably don't want an in-depth philosophical discussion about their goals or beliefs. But then we can kind of change tack according to the situation, and then maybe at a more convenient time say, well, now we're going to dispute some of those beliefs or look at the goals that you're setting, which might invite some of these maladaptive emotions. And I guess these maladaptive emotions is kind of what we want to dig into a little bit deeper. So, like, why might an emotion be particularly maladaptive? If I'm feeling angry about something, one thing I often hear people say is, I just got filled with rage, or just saw the red mist, something like that. And from a teleological point of view and an REBT point of view, I would say, well, this is kind of related to your goals, and your beliefs mediated that reaction. So, what kind of belief might create somebody to have a particularly angry or low frustration tolerance would be the term that we'd use in RBT, like reaction to something, and why might that be maladaptive to their goals?
Well, the key thing is with RBT and the theory it has of emotion is it, and we've mentioned it. I know we've mentioned this before. Kind of binary theory of emotion. Now, most other approaches have a unitary theory of emotion. By that I mean that when it's low, it's good, and when it's high, it's bad. So take anxiety. The lower the anxiety, the better.
Yeah.
And if anxiety is high, then it's naturally worse. Now, we know that's not the case in sport. I mean, I've worked with countless athletes for whom anxiety is actually a key ingredient for successful performance. So we know that's not the case. It's not as simple as having a unitary low is good, high is bad. And obviously you would flip that for things like happiness. The scale would flip. Obviously, high is good, low is bad. RBT offers something different. It says that actually there's a binary. It's not unitary, it's binary. So you can have high and low healthy anxiety and high and low unhealthy anxiety. And the thing that distinguishes them, and this gets forgotten so often, even when people are trying to develop measures of this thing, they forget that the definition rests upon behaviour. This is about action tendencies, behavioural intentions, and actual behaviour. So how do I know this anxiety is unhealthy? It's unhealthy because it is related to and elicits behaviours that take me away from my goal. And if my goal is to be healthy and functional, then it takes me away from that goal. So it's unhealthy. If it takes me towards that goal, or at the very least doesn't take me away from that goal, if it actually facilitates me moving towards that thing, then it's healthy, then it's functional. It's helping me to function in relation to that goal. So its behaviour is really, really key. Not just enacted behaviour, but behavioural intentions. So if I'm experiencing anxiety and I'm telling myself constantly, my body and brain are telling me to avoid, to get away from this, but I don't actually get away from it, then my intention is to avoid. So my behavioural intention is avoidance, and therefore unhealthy. We know that avoidance is problematic. It's not a very good coping mechanism. It's not a very good emotion regulation strategy when we think about things like anxiety. Of course, there are some situations where you'd want to escape from for survival purposes. That's not the area that we're talking about here. We're talking about, an athlete about to come on to the field of play, but actually desperately not wanting to be in that situation. We know that's an unhealthy anxiety. Versus, okay, well, look, this is important. I'm going to take extra preparation. I'm going to do all the right things. But they're still feeling anxious.
Yeah.
The anxious feeling is still there in terms of symptoms, but the behavioural intention and the behaviour itself is healthy and functional. So behaviour is really the key when we're trying to understand the differences between unhealthy and healthy emotions at sea.
And this is that nuance you were speaking about earlier. This is, I can still feel anxious, but it doesn't mean I'm necessarily not going to perform well. It depends how I'm interpreting that and whether I'm disputing that. You mentioned this, this example there of, an athlete maybe going on, maybe as a substitute and feeling anxious about something and not really wanting to be there. Like a wonderful example, but obviously I'm a little bit biased here, but I just think it's worthwhile one to bring up, is around officials. So we know that, what the official's role is to try to get as many calls right as possible. Now, what we know is that decision-making accuracy in the last like kind of 10, 15 minutes of sports fixtures, whether this be rugby, football, Australian rules football has some evidence around this as well, tends to go down. And yet distance between the official and the incident doesn't really change or fluctuate depending on the time of the game. So it's not a case of, oh, this person's tired and didn't see it. Obviously, that may happen on the odd occasion, but over an aggregate, it doesn't. So avoidance is actually identified as a kind of a key coping strategy for officials, i.e., I don't want to kind of make a decision that's going to be particularly controversial that maybe I would be blamed for if it turned out to be wrong. So I'll take the safer option. And then on review, in hindsight, that may be slightly incorrect or totally incorrect. And so that avoidance that anxiety might prompt might be particularly pertinent for this particular population. And I feel that that's quite a nice example of how, it's like you mentioned, it's binary. You can still feel anxious, but that anxiety might promote you to making the right decisions or have adaptive actions dependent on your goal, or it can work the other way around, as opposed to just this kind of unitary approach of, well, I'm feeling anxious, I need to minimize that straight away because there's no good can come of it.
Yeah, and also, the idea that your emotional experience can confirm your beliefs. So how do I know this situation is terrible and intolerable? Because I'm so anxious. So again, we're using that emotion as a signal. As an individual, you're trying to figure out what's going on in this situation. Am I safe? Is it optimal for my goals? And you can use that emotion as a signal that things aren't right. And this is terrible. This is awful. This is because I wouldn't be feeling it this way if it wasn't so. So again, it's this connection, this deep connection between each aspect of the GABC that it's hard to get away from, and is always in the room when we're working with people, and even as an individual when you're going through life yourself. There's those deep connections between them. One thing I would say around that issue is that because each of these elements interacts with each other, behaviours like avoidance can have an impact. So we're at C. Avoidance we're treating as a behaviour that's associated with unhealthy anxiety at C. Okay, that might confirm my belief that this is terrible and awful. Okay, so that might mean that in the future, I'm just going to avoid any potential A's that might trigger that anxiety. So I start to constrain my behavior. I start to not do things that I could do to help me develop or to give me a richer, more fulfilling life because of the anxiety. I start to avoid those A's. Now, to do that, what I could do is just completely restrict my goals. Maybe I'm not going to be that kind of person that goes out there, is outgoing and performs well and saves the day and all that stuff. Maybe I'll constrain my goals so that I never really have to go into situations that make me uncomfortable enough that I have to avoid them. So avoidance is one of those behaviours, same as withdrawal, where it affects everything going back down the chain. I say back down the chain because of how we visualise the GABC. I know it doesn't make any sense to say back down the chain because they're all happening at the same time and they're all interconnected. But avoidance is one of those nice example behaviours that we can use that we know affects all of the other aspects, and then it feeds itself, and it makes it more likely that when you do go into those situations, you're even more anxious, you're even more wanting to avoid it. Aggression has a similar. It's similar, say unhealthy anger that leads to violence. Aggression, obviously, particularly in sport, can be a good thing depending on the context. If it's coming from a place of violent anger, then maybe not so much. Again, that has consequences back down the chain. So we're trying to always take these things in these categories because it makes them workable, and we abstract people's experiences into GABC because it provides neat little categories for us to work with. Always in the knowledge that it's all deeply interconnected, and when you change one, everything else changes.
What would our key sort of takeaways be today? I mean, one for me would be this notion of, I'd want the listener to go away thinking, okay, so emotions are binary. So we can have good anxiety or good anger. and we can have bad anxiety and bad anger, or healthy or unhealthy, helpful or unhelpful might be better terms to use there. We also know that everything's interconnected. So, we mentioned this, try to avoid the brick in the wall approach of, this leads to that, which leads to that, because it's all going on at the same time. And so we can focus on different parts. And that's a nice aspect of REBT. It's quite kind of attractive, if you like it. Okay, we can focus on this one today, or I can focus on that part today. But in reality, what we want to do is, Ellis called this elegant REBT, where we focus on the B's, because that's kind of going to mediate the interactions between the rest. Any kind of other key points that you think we should emphasize?
I think the only one for me would be to, when we're thinking about unhealthy and healthy emotion, to think about behaviour rather than severity of how the emotion feels.
Okay.
Just because you're experiencing something intense does not necessarily mean that it's maladaptive, that it's not going to help you. So maybe it makes sense to, even if you're experiencing a really intense emotion, and in RBT we call this flooding or staying there.
Yeah.
Staying there with that emotion.
Yeah.
Understand that it doesn't end you, it doesn't kill you, it doesn't even necessarily affect your performance. Learn to be acceptant and tolerant of that intense emotion, because it might be functional. Let's find out, rather than avoiding the situation to completely avoid experiencing that negative emotion.
Well, I see this lots in performance environments, because like athletes will work really, really hard to achieve something and then feel really nervous for a final, for instance. Before the 100-meter final, the sprinter feels more nervous than he or she would in other events. And yet, this is what you wanted. Like, you wanted to experience this. But then I guess this is because the beliefs of, I have to win this, I'm going to get another opportunity, and so on and so forth. That term flooding, by the way, just because I'm really into reading about Adler at the moment, Adler called it just encouragement. So he felt that the role of, like a parent or a therapist would just be to encourage. So people have their own tasks, their own responsibilities. So I guess rather than sort of like reinforcing like good and bad, i.e., well, this is a good feeling or a bad feeling around this, it would just be encourage people to do exactly what you just said, and that's to stay in there and not to associate the situation with their emotions.
Yeah, in lots of the cognitive behavioural therapies, we have exposure techniques that encourage people to do the things that they fear, to do the things that they would normally try to avoid. And we talked earlier in the conversation about the natural disputation of beliefs through experiences. What we're trying to do there again with exposure techniques is fast forward that process. Dispute your own belief that this is awful and terrible and the end of the world, and I'm an idiot when it happens, by actively seeking those experiences and using that experience to dispute your own beliefs. And that happens at the very start of RBT with Albert Ellis on the park bench. Talking to women, trying to make a date with women through a phobia of the opposite sex. That behavioural piece of work that then backwards helps to dispute the belief that is hindering that behaviour.
I guess one thing I'd sort of just maybe add to finish on, Martin, is that point there about how, well, one, you kind of have to do it. It's like that B in CBT and REBT is important. Eventually we have to challenge behaviours, and we can't just talk about it. It has to be an action. And REBT is particularly active directive, but also, aligned with that, REBT it's humanistic. It acknowledges that, this is hard. Like I understand, like, you're feeling anxious. Like, I understand that you may be experiencing high levels of frustration or sadness or whatever it may be around this, and yet, we're here to encourage, like, and support, and not judge, or kind of take an expert role. We're working together to get through this.
Well, I think, in the next conversation, maybe we talk about disputation, because one of the reputation, look, some of REBT's reputation is to do with how active directive it is, rather than how active directive it can be, depending on the person you're working with, and depending on how you like to operate as a practitioner, within a certain context. But we're only ever helping the individual to challenge their own problematic ideas and thoughts. And they're only problematic because the individual is telling us they are, and we've figured it out together. It's not that somebody says, this is terrible, and we say, oh, that's irrational, that's unhelpful, that's going to lead to problems, I'll dispute it straight away. we're not disputing the client. We're not challenging the athlete. We're helping the athlete to extract the things that aren't working for them, and then together we dispute them, figure scientifically what are the problems with some of the things that you think, and some of the things that you believe, and how can we shape beliefs that are more evidence-based, more logical, and more helpful for you. So it's got this idea that it's reputation, and it's because these are the headlines of REBT. That's disputation, challenge, telling people what you think is wrong and this way of thinking is right. That's almost never the case, and I don't really think good REBT practitioners work in that way. You are working together with somebody to figure out these issues and problems. They're coming to you for a reason. They're not performing as they'd like to perform, or they're experiencing maybe some emotional difficulties. They're facing some challenges in their lives. You look at the framework and you say, okay, where are the bits and pieces that we can apply here that helps the individual to attain what they want to attain? And then you go from there. The part of that recipe is going to be the beliefs and ideas they hold about performance, about themselves, about the world. It's just one of the things that you address on the way to helping the individual. This isn't about challenging people and telling them what to think. As you said there, Stu, it's humanistic. It's driven by that person. Just because it's a CBT doesn't make it any less humanistic than some of the more person-centered approaches you might see. And it's a frustration of mine that it gets categorized in a way that's not humanistic, because it's been there since the start. We've just forgotten about it. So I think it's something maybe we talk about in the next conversation. We should probably get into D and disputation and talk about exactly what that is and some of the methodologies that we can apply. And we touched on this a while ago about how we can use some of those ideas of disputation on beliefs, but also outside of those beliefs, and how the idea of evidence, logic, and function is actually quite a useful philosophy to approach performance generally.
I think that's a great idea. So I think for the listeners, we look forward to welcoming you back next time, where we're going to talk about disputation, and maybe as well we talk about Martin's frustration and whether that frustration is healthy or unhealthy.
Probably unhealthy.
Wonderful. Thanks for listening,
Good
everybody.
Good to chat again, Stu.
Yeah,
everybody.
you too,
See you
Martin.
in the next one.